Dictatorships. Everyone's talking about it, authoritarianism. But did you know one of the longest reigning dictatorships in history was overthrown without a single drop of blood being shed? This is the story of Portugal in the Carnation Revolution, and this is the Continuum. For nearly 50 years, Portugal lived under silence. Newspapers were censored, books were banned, music silenced. This was the Estudio Novo, the new state, a dictatorship created in 1933 by Antonio de Oliveira Salazar. Salazar ruled Portugal not with rallies or spectacle, but with quiet control. He wrapped repression in the language of order, discipline, and morality. He called it stability. But for the Portuguese people, it was chains. The secret police watched everyone. A joke whispered in a cafe could mean a midnight arrest. A neighbor could be an informer. Fear seeped into everyday life. Political parties? Illegal. Free press? Non-existent. Strikes? Banned. And beyond fear, there was poverty. By the 1970s, Portugal was the poorest country in Western Europe. Families scraped by while the dictatorship poured money into defending colonies in Africa. For most of the world, empires had collapsed. But Portugal clung to its colonies in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, and it was paid in the price of blood. Tens of thousands of young Portuguese men were drafted to fight in endless colonial wars. Many did not return. Those who did came home scarred, not only by the fighting, but by the realization that they were dying for a regime that offered them nothing. By the early 1970s, discontent was everywhere, in the factories, in the countryside, in the barracks. But the dictatorship still stood, unmoved. Portugal was a nation in change, bound by censorship, bound by war, bound by fear. But in silence, resistance was growing, and soon, those chains would break. By the late 1960s, Antonio Salazar's regime was coming to an end. After decades of iron-fisted control, the dictator suffered a stroke. He lingered in silence, unaware that he had been quietly replaced. His successor, Marcelo Continuum, stepped into power in 1968. A law professor, polished and eloquent, Continuum promised apertura, an opening, a new dawn for Portugal. But that dawn never came. The censorship remained. The secret police still stalked the streets. Torture chambers still echoed with screams. In the countryside, peasants lived in deep poverty, working the land with tools unchanged for centuries. In the cities, factory workers endured long hours of meager pay. And across society, women were kept under strict laws, unable to vote or divorce, expected to remain silent and obedient. Even the education system was designed to mold obedience. Children recited loyalty to the regime, textbooks preached nationalism, Catholic morality, and devotion to empire. For many, there was no future, but for some, silence turned into resentment. By the early 1970s, prisons swelled with dissidents, communists, socialists, labor activists, even writers and musicians. The walls of Lisbon's famous Caxiça prison held some of Portugal's brightest voices, silenced but unbroken. And yet, the regime projected confidence. Continuum reassured his generals, his ministers, and the world that Portugal was stable, that the Estudio Novia was eternal. But beneath the surface, cracks were spreading. The colonial wars drained money, energy, and the youth. The economy faltered, and ordinary Portuguese grew restless under the dictatorship's grip. Underground networks of students and intellectuals and soldiers quietly defied censorship, spreading forbidden books, songs, and manifestos. The regime's grip was firm, but it was slipping. In 1970, while much of the world looked towards the future, space travel, computers, new freedoms, Portugal was fighting wars from another century. Thousands of young men, some barely out of school, were drafted and sent to fight in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea. These were not quick campaigns. They were endless, grinding wars stretching year after year. The regime called it defending the empire. They claimed Portugal was a single, united nation that stretched across continents. But for the soldiers in the jungle, there was no glory, only heat, exhaustion, and death. In Guinea, guerrilla fighters struck from the forest, vanishing before Portuguese troops could respond. In Mozambique and Angola, nationalist movements gathered strength, supported by the winds of decolonization sweeping Africa. Portugal stood almost alone, the last European empire trying to cling to its colonies by force. At home, the cost was devastating. Letters returned with news of sons killed in faraway lands, families grieving silently while the regime told them their sacrifice was noble. The truth? It was unsustainable. The war devoured Portugal's economy. Nearly half of the national budget went to fighting in Africa. While schools crumbled and villages remained poor, money poured into weapons, ships, and soldiers. And the young men who survived came home disillusioned. They had fought not for freedom, but to protect a dictatorship's dying empire. For the junior officers, the captains who led the troops into unwinnable battles, the anger was sharper. They saw the incompetence of their leaders. They saw their men suffer, and they began to ask questions. Why should they fight and die for a government that gave them no voice, no future, and no truth? Out of this discontent, something began to form. An idea that the military itself could change Portugal. The dictatorship had built its strength on the army, but soon the army would turn against it. For decades, Portugal's military had been the arm of the dictatorship. It enforced censorship, maintained order, and fought colonial wars. But by the end of the early 1970s, it had also become the dictatorship's greatest weakness. The young officers, the captains, were exhausted. They led their men through ambushes in Angola, patrols in Mozambique, jungle warfare in Guinea. They saw the toll in blood. They saw the futility. In 1973, the regime pushed one reform too far. It created a policy that would allow conscripted officers, men without military academy training, to advance in rank more quickly than career officers. To the captains, who had spent years fighting and sacrificing, this was an insult. It was proof that the regime cared nothing for their lives, their dignity, and their service. From this frustration, the Movimento das Forças Armadas was born, the Armed Forces Movement, known simply as the MFA. At first, they were just a small group of disillusioned officers quietly meeting in apartments, cafes, and remote barracks. They talked about the war, about the waste, about the dictatorship that refused to change. But soon, their conversation turned into something more dangerous. What if they, the captains themselves, ended the war? What if they ended the dictatorship? This was not a plot for personal power. These men were not generals dreaming of thrones. These were soldiers who wanted democracy. They wanted Portugal to be free. Throughout 1973, the MFA grew. Officers from across Portugal and its colonies quietly joined. They formed councils, made contracts, built networks. They debated endlessly, not just on how to overthrow the dictatorship, but how to replace it. They imagined elections, free press, the end of censorship, the end of the colonial wars. And by the end of the year, this plan was clear. They would stage a coup, not with blood, but with precision. They would strike at the heart of the regime in Lisbon, neutralize its defenders, and force Continuum to surrender. The captains were ready, but the coup needed more than a plan. It needed a signal. And in April of 1974, that signal would come from a song. On the night of April 24th, 1974, Lisbon was calm. Cafes were closing, streets were quiet, and most citizens had no idea that history was only hours away. But hidden across the city, in apartments, barracks, and cars parked in shadowy alleys, soldiers and officers were waiting. Waiting for a song. The MFA, the Armed Forces Movement, had chosen music as their secret signal. At 10:55 p.m., the first cue went out. A light pop song called E Despios de Deus, and After the Goodbye. Broadcast on Portuguese radio, it sounded harmless, but to the conspirators, it was a message. Be ready. Then, at 12:20 a.m., came the second signal. Grandiola Villa Manero, a song by folk singer Jose Afonso. It was banned on most stations, too closely tied to resistance, too dangerous in its simplicity. Its lyrics praised fraternity, equality, and the people. The moment it played on Radio Renaissance, officers across Portugal sprang into action. Telephones rang, orders were whispered, convoys rolled out. The coup had begun. Columns of tanks and armored cars moved into Lisbon. Soldiers set up checkpoints on bridges, secured airports, surrounded government buildings. But this was no chaotic uprising. Every movement had been planned, every unit carefully placed, and above all, there was one guiding principle: avoid bloodshed. As dawn approached, Lisbon woke to the sight of soldiers in the street. For the first time in decades, the dictatorship looked fragile, and all this began with a song. April 25th, 1974, Lisbon awoke to the sound of tanks. At first, citizens were confused. Was this a crackdown? Another show of force by the regime? But as people stepped cautiously into the streets, they saw something different. Soldiers, young, tense, and nervous, but not threatening. They stood at intersections, rifles slung low, unsure of what the day would bring. And then, something extraordinary happened. Outside a small cafe near the Chiado district, a florist named Celeste Nero had been preparing to open her shop. With no customers that morning, though, she carried her flowers into the street and began handing them out to soldiers. She gave them carnations, red and white, placing the stems into the barrels of their rifle. Soon, others joined: market vendors, shopkeepers, students. One by one, flowers filled the rifles. Red carnations in gun barrels, white carnations in the helmets of the young men who, only days before, had expected to fight in Africa. The streets began to change. Fear melted into joy. Strangers hugged soldiers. Children climbed on top of armored cars. Old women pressed food into the hand of the conscripts. Instead of repression, the people felt possibility. Instead of fear, they felt freedom, blooming, like flowers opening after a long winter. And so, the coup became a revolution, not of violence, but of unity. A revolution marked not by gunfire, but by carnations. By midday, Lisbon was alive with celebration. The people had joined the soldiers, and together, they were unstoppable. April 25th, 1974. As carnations filled the rifles in the street, the dictatorship crumbled. hour by hour. By noon, Lisbon was in the hands of the soldiers. Radio stations, airports, ministries, all secured by the MFA. Checkpoints sealed the city, but one building still held out, the Camarero Barracks. Inside, Prime Minister Marcelo Cantinero had retreated with loyalists and elements of the secret police. Surrounded, he waited. Outside, thousands of citizens gathered. They pressed against the barracks, chanting for freedom. But the MFA knew one wrong move could turn a peaceful uprising into a massacre. The standoff stretched for hours. MFA tanks rolled into position outside the barracks. Snipers lined the rooftops. Soldiers aimed their rifles, Carnations, still stuck into the barrels. Then, negotiations began. Marcelo Cantinero agreed to surrender, but only to a senior officer. He refused to hand power to a junior captain. To him, they were rebels. So the MFA called upon General Antonio de Spinola, a respected figure, a man with enough authority to receive the dictatorship's permission. When Spinola arrived, the end was near. Cantinero stepped out, pale and shaken. Under the watch of soldiers half his age, citizens shouting insults, some demanding his arrest, and others demanding worse. But the MFA insisted there would be no executions, no bloodshed. Marcelo Cantinero was escorted away to exile. The Estudio Novio, a dictatorship that had ruled Portugal for nearly 50 years, had fallen. The crowd erupted in celebration. Church bells rang, car horns blared, soldiers embraced citizens in the streets. The people had reclaimed their country, without a civil war, without a bloodbath. It was not perfect, it was not simple, but it was freedom. On the morning of April 26, 1974, Portugal awoke to a different country. The dictatorship was gone, the secret police had been dissolved, political prisoners were being freed. For the first time in nearly half a century, the people of Portugal could speak, gather, and dream without fear. Within days, newspapers published freely, censorship collapsed overnight. Political parties, once banned, returned, organizing rallies in public squares. The revolution spread beyond Lisbon, across the countryside. Peasants occupied estates, demanding land reform, and in factories, workers pushed for better wages and conditions. In universities, students flooded lecture halls with debates about democracy. Portugal, silenced for so long, was suddenly alive with voices. But freedom came with challenges. The colonial empire unraveled. Within 2 years, Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea, Cape Verde, and Santon all gained independence. It was a turbulent process, marked by war, migration, and uncertainty, but it ended nearly 5 centuries of empire. Portugal itself transformed. In 1976, the country held free elections, a new constitution enshrined democracy, civil liberties, and social rights. And through the struggles, the compromises, one symbol endured, the Carnation. Red carnations became an emblem of revolution. Simple, ordinary flowers that came to represent extraordinary change. They were tucked into rifles, not to fire, but to remind the world that Portugal had chosen peace over violence. Today, April 25th is a national holiday in Portugal, Freedom Day. Each year, the streets fill with music, parades, and carnations, remembering the movement when a nation, long bound by silence, found its voice. The Carnation Revolution was not just a coup. It was not just the end of a dictatorship. It was proof that even after decades of oppression, freedom can bloom, quietly, peacefully, and beautifully. So let's look at some of the similarities that I see between the Carnation Revolution and what we're seeing now in the United States. The first thing that came to mind was Antonio Salazar suffered a stroke, and that really is what made him a silent person at the time. And Trump has definitely suffered a stroke. You can see it on his left side, it's pretty evident. And his diet means that it's probably going to happen again, even worse. Another similarity I see is they were getting tired of the wars, and I think the US is at that point. We were tired of the wars in the Middle East. We're tired of the wars just across the world that we're involved in. And I think the military is at that point too. We saw that Portugal's military budget was astronomical, and so is the US. So those are some of the similarities I'm watching. And I think that could really draw some parallels between what is going to happen in the US and what happened in Portugal. But this proves that dictatorships can be taken down peacefully and without massive starvation level events, massive extinction level events of a population, if people want to do it peacefully. This has been the Continuum. Thank you for listening.